The government has just handed down the mid-year update. It's known as MyEFA, of course. It could be the last update before the coming federal election. Our business editor, Ross Greenwood, is in town, which means it must be a big deal. He joins me here at the desk. So just out of the Treasurer's press conference, Ross, he's trying to paint this as better than the Coalition would have produced. In other words, you know, we're already in that tussle over the best economic management.
You know, one of the things about any budget, it doesn't matter who you are, where you are, it's always where you start. To the comparison, and where they start this comparison is at PFO, which is effectively just after the last election. And what they're really saying in this is, if you look at that and where the Coalition would have imagined the budget being right now, hey, we're doing much, much better. Now, you can see this in some of the numbers they come up with, but the reality is the budget deficit is deteriorating fast. So this is over the next 4 years. And effectively, over the next 4 years, this is $143.9 billion worth of losses, which is worse than what they were forecasting in May this year of $112.9 billion. So we're talking there about the best part of some $31 billion worse off the government will be. Now, the important part about this, Tom, is really that is going to add to the debts and the deficits. But heroically, over the longer forecast here, they're actually saying that in 10 years' time, this will actually come back into a surplus. Like, you know, the government's just had 2 surpluses. They hang their credentials on that, and they're saying, look, wait, hang around for 10 years. We might get the same thing again. Second thing also is to look at this is because the government is spending more money. Effectively, the government is actually bringing in more money, but it's spending more money. And you can see this spending growth. Spending growth in this financial year up by 2.9%, the following year 5.7%, and the year after that 2.8%. The government said this is necessary on things such as Medicare, on things such as its extended childcare concessions that it will give out, things that it says are necessary, which it also says that the Coalition, if they object to those things, effectively are objecting to families getting extra compensation as well. There's also other aspects of this, and that is this is all dependent on the number of people who have got jobs. It depends on commodity prices. So if we go and have a quick look at some of the forecasts that are there, really it's one of these situations. You have a look at iron ore prices, pretty much steady, all of these, but much lower than the $100 a tonne that iron ore is right now. Metallurgical coal, which is used in steelmaking, $140 a tonne. It's sitting around those levels or a little higher now. Thermal coal, which is used for energy generation, $70 a tonne. In other words, this is where they get wriggle room in the budget. If those prices stay higher, there's more money longer term in the budget as well. And then when you go to things such as the unemployment rate, when you go to things such as the other economic data that's out there, Tom, some of those are broadly similar to where they were in the budget. And you can see here, say, GDP thinks it's going to be a little softer. Unemployment and the inflation rate are the same as what they were forecasting in May, but wages growth is off a touch. The important and controversial one is the net migration rate. And what this is all about is it's 80,000 people higher now than what they were forecasting back in May. In other words, more people in the country than this crackdown on migration. And the interesting part about that, of course, is that they're saying that ultimately many people are simply staying in the country longer than what they anticipated.
Yeah, which sort of begs the question of how the Coalition will bring that down. That'll be a fight we hear about close to the election. I want to drill down on this. There's all these different figures, and when Labor says we can't, you know, who would stop this spending?
Yes.
On aged care, on index payments, doesn't it come back to the real figure here, spending as a percentage of GDP?
100%.
So it's 27.2%. That's really high.
Yes.
Slightly lower than COVID times.
That's right.
Way higher than before.
But you'd have to say also that one of the highest spending governments that we've seen in the past sort of almost 20 years. Now, if you take outside the periods of the global financial crisis, of the 1990s recession, of the crisis of COVID, this is the highest spending government that we have seen. And I think Australians would recognise that because it's not as though they're not getting revenue. They're getting lots of revenue in through the door. There's extra tax takes that are coming in through so many people working right now and through bracket creep, but they're also spending at a pretty decent clip as well.
Which brings us back to this. If you want to deliver the surplus we spoke about in 10 years or earlier, you have to either bring down that spending, and it doesn't have to be in cutting aged care, whatever it might be. You find other areas, or you say, this is the new normal, ageing population, whatever it might be, we need to increase taxes, because otherwise you retain a structural deficit. And that means unless you're having a great year, you have a deficit.
Well, that's how are you going to sell that, though? How are you going to sell increasing taxes? There's another way of doing it, which I suspect is what the Treasurer's plan would be beyond the next election. And that plan would be to grow the economy faster. If you grow the economy faster, a lot of the ills of your spending disappear very, very quickly. But for that, you've got to have the Chinese government basically stimulating its economy. You've got to get the Chinese consumers back and spending. But one thing I did do is just talk about this issue about households. They've been in recession for 2 years now. And so personal recession. So the important aspect of this is really, and one other aspect of it, is that the government has basically taken in almost $18 to $19 billion of extra taxes in this financial year since the budget. And yet in the first year of the stage 3 tax cuts, $20 billion. So let's go to a question I asked the Treasurer about this as to whether he's the Treasurer who's giving with one hand but taking with the other.
The reason why I don't agree with that is because the number that you refer to is bigger than tax. And so I think the tax upgrades in this mid-year update, if you take out, well, the Commonwealth upgrades, which take out the GST and some of the other things, is about $7.3 billion. And that's about a third of the tax cuts, and it's less than a tenth of the average upgrade over the last 4 updates. And so we've had a very, very small upgrade to revenue, nothing like we've become accustomed to in the last few, and so the income tax cuts are much bigger than that. And I'd also say that it's not coming necessarily from the same places. Ordinarily, not in this update, we've had a write-down in company taxes, but in the last few updates before this, one of the big drivers has been company taxes. And so it's not quite comparing apples with apples. Now, we're providing income tax relief for every Australian taxpayer for good reason. To give them a bit of help with the cost of living, also to return bracket creep in the way that makes the most economic sense. And we're proud that those tax cuts are flowing right now because we took a political risk to deliver them, but we know that they're doing good.
So, Tom, that's an interesting argument for households to think about because they're still feeling the pinch despite the tax cuts, despite those energy bill relief that the government's already handed out.
And when governments are asked, or the Treasurer is asked around another tax cut, and people go, oh, well, hang on, they're rolling out income tax cut phase 3. Your point is, overall, households have basically given that to the government. The invisible hand, inflation, we know it's working, it's been on steroids, so you get a huge announcement about here are your billions. Every day, incrementally, a little bit is handed back.
And while you've got so many people in the workforce, 3.9% unemployment rate now, which the government forecast will go to 4.5%, but still very strong employment numbers. But the reality is people are getting pushed up into the next tax bracket all the time. So therefore, the share of their income that's going to the government in tax continues to rise. So he was asked today about whether there's a scope for the Labor government, this government, to actually give out more tax cuts in the future. Now, you'd think that that'd be working against the Reserve Bank if they did that. But he actually said, well, listen, I'm not going to pretend what happens in the future parliaments, or whether it's us or whether it's a coalition government in the future. But there is going to be always an argument about bringing tax rates down. And this is to that very argument about bracket creep is taking away some or much of what is being given by the government in these stage 3 tax cuts.
You said before, good luck for a government to sort of raise taxes or cut spending. What about indexing tax rates?
Well, that's as you call it, the silent hand. It just keeps on coming in for them.
Ross Greenwood, thank you. Good analysis there of MyEFO, the final big political day of the year, if you like.